Okay, thanks, Greg. Welcome everyone to our presentation today. It's good to see so many people logged on there. So what I intend to do today is just have a look at our current climate outlook, where we've been and where we're going, and then look at some more figures on information on feeding horses, sheep and goats. So we'll look at the climate, what the current situation is, and probably more importantly, just where to get some climate information. There's a plethora of information out there, and often it can be a bit confusing. So we'll drill down and work out what might be the best places to find this sort of information. Then we'll talk about feeding, and today we'll concentrate on horses and sheep and goats, and in one of the following webinars we'll look at Roger Sneath will look at feeding cattle. The other thing that we often forget about in a lot of these feeding, when we are feeding, is about water supply, and then eventually when it does rain, what's the best options to with our feeding program after it has rained. So having a look at climate now. This is looking at the rainfall percentiles across Australia for the last 12 months. And you can see that despite the really good rainfall that we did have in February and March, that there's still quite a large area of southeast Queensland that is still in that well below or extremely low rainfall percentile. You can see that quite a few areas in New South Wales there have picked up, but still some of those highlands and some of the areas where probably those cropping areas haven't done so well. And you can see down there in Victoria that they've had a really good break to autumn, and that'll be good for their cropping season down there. And obviously this will affect the amount of feed that is available on the eastern seaboard in Australia later on in the year. So at the moment it is certainly looking better this year for the cropping season than it has in previous years. So if we drill down a bit more and just look at Queensland, we can see that it's a really patchy looking situation there for the last 6-month period. So a lot of areas have got a significant break, particularly in coastal areas of southeast Queensland. And it's good to see that southwestern Queensland has also got a break in the season there to help pick things up. But how does this look as far as the drought declarations of the state are concerned? And if we look at the Queensland, the shires that were drought declared on the 1st of March, we can see that there's over 65% of the shires in southern Queensland still drought declared. Most of the drought committees will have had their meetings by now to decide whether shires should continue to be drought declared or not. And I'd say, looking at that picture, you wouldn't think there would be too many changes happening in the near future. So what's driving our weather at the current time? This is from the Bureau of Meteorology, and these are all the effects that impact on our weather across Queensland and Australia. And if you count up all those different effects on weather, there's about 18 of them there. And there's some of the longer term ones that we can look at to try and just get an inkling of what's happening as far as the weather's concerned. So the three main ones there are El Nino and La Nina, which everyone's pretty well aware of, and also the Indian Ocean. And probably not so many people are aware of the effect it might have on our weather. The other interesting one to look at is the one down the bottom of that particular map there. It's called the Southern Annular Mode. And some of the really quite recent research from the Bureau of Meteorology has found that that can have quite an effect on the number of heat waves that we tend to get in southern Queensland through the early part of summer. So there's some really quite good research going on looking into these things at the current time. So what are the two main climate drivers that we'll look at? The first one is in the Indian Ocean Dipole, and what they do there is look at the sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean to determine what sort of effect that's having on our weather. And then we have in the Pacific Ocean, you can see it's a huge area of water there, drives a lot of the world's climate. And there's two white boxes there called Nino 3.4, and for Australia, we need to watch what's happening in those boxes as far as the sea surface temperature is concerned to determine what sort of weather we might be likely to get in the coming season. So what's happening as far as those climate drivers are concerned? If we look at the Southern Oscillation Index, it's just that difference in air pressure between Tahiti and Darwin. At the current time, it's around about that negative 2.1. So if we've got an SOI that's more than positive 7, that's the sort of pattern that we're looking for more favourable rainfall over summer. If we go below negative 7, we usually end up with some drier weather. So currently we're in what they call a neutral pattern. So you can see in that map of sea surface temperatures just below there, you can see in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that essentially that there's no anomalies as far as temperature is concerned. The interesting thing to look at though is the warm temperatures off northwest Australia and off the Queensland coastline. And those warmer temperatures around the country at the current time can give you some better chances of more localised rainfall. If we look at that 30-day moving SOI graph, you can see on the right-hand side there, you can see that the SOIs come up to around about that 0. It'll be interesting to watch at the end of May just to see what that SOI does. So most of the forecasts at the moment for the Pacific Ocean are for a neutral. The other main climate driver is the Indian Ocean Dipole. So that can affect our rainfall and temperature patterns over Australia. And generally, it's from that period from May through to October. Currently, that Indian Ocean Dipole's neutral, but the best conditions for us are when that Indian Ocean Dipole's negative. So if you look at that graph down there, you can see that from those lines that are all the model runs, they're starting to indicate that we've probably got more chance of having a negative IOD. So that may point to a much better winter outlook than the one that we had this time last year. So this is the outlook from the Bureau of Meteorology at the moment, and you can see from the top of that graph for May that the chance of exceeding median rainfall for a lot of Queensland is round about average or less than average. But once we get into June, May and July, and even June to August, you can see that our chance of exceeding median rainfall are really quite good in comparison to what it would have been this time last year. Last year, we were in the between about 25 to 35% chance of exceeding median rainfall. Probably the thing to remember is that June and August are some of our drier months of the year, so it probably doesn't mean a huge amount of rainfall, but I'm sure everyone would be quite keen to have a wetter winter than we had last year. So the other thing is temperature, and this is also allied to those warmer sea surface temperatures that we saw around the coast of Australia, and you can see that the forecast for temperature, so that's chance of above medium maximum temperature for June to August is much higher than it might normally be. That doesn't mean that we're not going to get frosts. We can still get frosts, but on average it looks like we'll have warmer temperatures for winter this year. So where do we get some of this climate information? The Bureau of Meteorology have got a very good phone app which gives you a 7-day forecast, and that also includes the radar. The other thing that you can get on the Bureau's website is a thing called METI. So that gives you really quite a comprehensive forecast for your area, and it does that on 5-kilometre grid squares, so you can get quite a lot of information for the next 7 days on things like temperature, direction of wind, and it's probably the most comprehensive forecast that you'll be able to get for your own location. And just on the side there, I've also included a 10-day forecast from a site called WX Maps, and you can look at the next 7 days or the following 7 days after that, and look at it. Be careful when you look at it. Don't get too much hope, because always after 7 days, it always seems to be a better forecast than often what might happen. But anyway, it gives you a bit of a clue into the future as what sort of weather that we might be getting. The other thing that is useful for people to have a look at is that long-term climate information. That's also available from the Bureau now, and there's also a handy little tool called Climate, and you can get that on your phone or your computer, and you'll be able to look at where am I at the current time in comparison to previous years for my current location, and will also give you an idea of what are my chances of getting a certain amount of rainfall in the coming season. So they're all very useful tools to help you give you some sort of insight into the type of weather that we might be getting. There's a lot of research going on at the moment under the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. There's 9 projects there that are taking place right across Australia at the current time, and they will be making quite a few changes as to the way weather's forecast in Australia and how people might be able to handle weather and be prepared for the variability in climate that we get. So a really good project that's looking at the future for weather forecasting across Australia. So we've looked at climate, and we'll just now look at feeding for horses and sheep. So going on to horses, when to feed, we've got a photo there. It's of a horse in condition score 2, and that's called moderate condition. So what we'll talk about just briefly in this under feeding horses, it won't be about feeding horses that are in work, and certainly won't be about feeding horses that are in poor condition to bring them up. It's essentially about maintenance feeding of horses. So in this here, you can see that the horse has got a flat rump either side of the backbone. The poverty line's visible, and that's that line down the back of the horse there, either side of the tail, that starts to develop once a horse loses weight. Ribs are just visible, narrow but firm neck, and the backbone's still well covered. So it's at that particular stage that you really should start thinking about feeding horses. The other thing to remember, horses being monogastrics, unlike cattle, they haven't got a rumen. They rely on that blind gut or the cecum to help them digest feed. So generally the feed goes through a horse a lot faster, and we see that by the amount of fibre that's in horse manure. So horses do need fibre, but they're less able to digest it compared to a ruminant animal. One of the things that can often be difficult with feeding horses is to estimate their weight. And this is just a pretty handy little chart to determine what sort of weight the horse might be. So it's got the height and hands on the left-hand side there, and also centimetres. It has the condition score of the horse, and then what the likely weight of that horse might be. So often people haven't got much of an idea of what weight their horse might be, but it's an important thing to know, not only for how much you might need to feed your horse, but it's also important to know for things like worming the horse. So just a handy tool to use if you haven't got a set of scales to weigh a horse. So feed quality, what are you going to feed your horse? So it can vary quite dramatically, from oats, which have got quite good energy and good protein, right down to some people in the last drought were feeding things like cane tops, which you really wouldn't recommend to feeding horses simply because of the high fibre levels. Horse pellets, something else that's fed quite commonly. The thing, if you are feeding horse pellets, to remember is look at the label, because often the crude protein levels on those horse pellets can differ quite markedly depending on the company that you buy them from. The other thing is grassy hay, and if you see hay advertised, well, grassy hay can mean all sorts of things. So you really need to investigate pretty carefully as to what you might be buying as far as grassy hay is concerned. Then we go on to lucerne hay and oaten hay. and then things like straw. So last drought or last year, there was probably a lot of straw and barley fed, but you really need to think about feeding an additional supplement if you are using some of those lower quality cereal hays to feed horses. So we've got some examples here of how much you need to feed a horse. So this is for maintenance only, not horses in work. Obviously, horses in work will need more feed than this, but on average, it's about 2.5% of the horse's body weight each day. So if you've got an idea of the horse's weight, that gives you a fair idea of how much you really need to feed them. So a horse of about 400 kilograms, you're looking at 10 kgs a day. Horse of 500 kilograms, 12.5. Horse up to 600, 15 kgs of dry matter per day. And the megajoules of energy there, it'll depend on the quality of feed that you have got to give you an idea of what megajoules of energy is there. So this was some figures that we did earlier in the year, and the only good news about these figures is that the prices that we had then have gone down quite considerably. But if we are feeding animals, and this is talking about full feeding animals, you can see there that it can start to add up to quite a lot of money feeding these animals. So at the bottom there, I've got an example. If you've got a 500 kg horse in a paddock with no pasture, it's going to eat about 12.5 kgs of hay every day. If you've got lucerne that weighs about 25 kgs a bale and they cost you $30, you're going to need that, feed that horse half a bale a day. So working that out, 15 bales a month at $30 is going to cost you about $450 a month to feed that particular 500 kilogram horse. So you can see it starts to add up quite significantly over a period of time, particularly if you multiply that by 5 horses. So you really need to sit down and do some figures, look at the rations that are available to you. And I suppose at the current time, the good news is that there's plenty of hay around and at a much more reasonable price than it was than when we did these initial figures. So some of the other important factors to consider when feeding horses is start to feed early before all that pasture's gone. Horses have got an ability to eat very low to the ground and make use of any grass that is there. If you are changing their feed, you really need to do that pretty slowly over about 5 to 7 days. So it's one of the things to do if you are changing the feed of the horse. Change that, put a kg of the what the new feed will be in with the current ration and gradually change it over time. The other thing with horses is they really do need their teeth checked because often without being able to chew or they need their teeth doing, they're not digesting that food properly. The other thing is horses, particularly in confined areas, worm status is very important. Obviously, the other things that you've got to deal with are things like competition at feeding time. So it's about safety for you and the horse. And then horses, if locked up, plenty of people have seen that they do develop some bad habits like wind sucking and chewing, that sort of thing. And often we'll have some horses are slow feeders, others, as we know, can be bits of gutses and eat really quickly. So they're all the things that we've got to take into consideration. I'll just move on to sheep and goats, and it's pretty much the same in this situation where we need to start feeding them early. So once their condition gets to moderate, we need to think about feeding sheep and goats. Often sheep, if they've got wool on them, it can be pretty hard to tell if those sheep, what condition they're actually in. But if you feel along the backbone and the short ribs, that'll give you an indication of the fat cover. So if you can feel those short ribs on the top of the spine quite easily, you're generally at a situation where you need to start feeding those sheep or goats. So sheep will eat about 2 to 3% of their body weight each day, and those younger sheep we use can eat up to 4%. grain's generally the best option for sheep because just because of the simpleness of feeding it. You can feed corn out on the ground simply because it's bigger grains, but generally all other grains need to be fed in troughs, and you need about 1 metre of trough space for every 6 sheep. If the sheep haven't had any grain feeding, you really need to start feeding them with a small amount of grain mixed with hay or a roughage for 4 to 7 days, and then increase the amount of grain gradually until they're on that full grain ration. So these are some figures that we also did around earlier on in the year, and obviously some of those prices have gone down quite a bit, but you can see in the right-hand column there that the cost per week per head can be quite significant, particularly if you start multiplying it by the number of sheep that you've got at the particular time. You'll see there that in most cases, just feeding grain is often the better option unless you've got some better quality hay. Another option with sheep is cottonseed, and it can be a very effective ration for sheep. And you can see there that daily intakes, and we used a figure of $700 per tonne for cottonseed. At the time, it nearly got up to about $900 a tonne. And the thing about cottonseed is you need to probably order early if you think you're going to need cottonseed with feeding sheep, as generally supply can be low. Once again, pellets are another option with sheep, but the thing with pellets are there's many types. They're all got varying energy and protein levels, and you need to have a look at the analysis of the pellet to try and determine how much of that pellet you will need to feed for an adequate ration. And at the time, those pellets are around about $500 a tonne, but talk with the supplier as to how much you might need to feed a sheep or goat. So other factors to think about if you have got goats, well, they can certainly use a wider range of paddock feed and browse. The other thing, make those changes to their diet slowly over a period of time. Think about the worming and the condition in teeth, particularly older animals, particularly older does and ewes. Poisonous plants, once we do get some rain, it's often when we do get poisoning, or once pasture starts to run out, animals start to look for other sources of feed. So things like pigweed, some of the hairy panic grasses can cause problem after rain. Other things like blue heliotrope all can be problematic for grazing. Goats have generally got a similar energy requirement to sheep, but there's evidence that under non-grazing conditions, their response to grain can differ significantly from sheep and cattle. So that's something that you've just got to watch with feeding goats. Water supplies. A thing to think about with water is that if you wouldn't like to drink it yourself, you really shouldn't be getting animals to drink that water also. So think about the quality of the water. So for sheep and goats, 6 to 14 litres a day, horses 25 to 50 litres a day. And obviously those figures will vary quite a bit depending on the type of season that you've got. Think about your management after the rain. Often when we get that short break, that'll increase. The thing about spelling pasture, it's going to increase the long-term pasture production of the paddock. So now's the time to think about a pasture budget for the coming season. Think about, well, end of March or now to think about how many stock can I take over this coming season. We've come out of a short-term growing season, so think about the actual bulk of pasture. Most of the grasses are gone to seed early, and I think once you get out and walk in a lot of paddocks, there's probably a bit less pasture bulk there than you think. Yeah, supplementary feeds are still really in short supply, but the good news is at least there's some excellent hay supplies available at the moment. So in summary, think about a pasture budget early. Have I got the time and money and the resources to feed? Think about reducing the numbers of stock. Most people have probably got lower stock numbers than normal at the current time. And think about budgeting. What's it going to really cost? And plan to feed after rain for a number of weeks to allow that pasture to recover. And once again, with feeding horses, start early, change feed early to avoid that colic. Think about the condition of teeth and parasite control. And obviously that goes for sheep and goats also. The other thing with sheep is to think about separating any pregnant ewes or does separately to dry animals. And often we've got ewes that might be having twins, and they've got much higher feed demands than a dry sheep or pregnant ewe with only one lamb. So there is some really good information available, and I've just listed a few websites there where you can get good information on feeding of sheep and goats and horses, and we'll make that available in the PDF of the presentation that people are available. So I'll finish off there and hand back to you, Greg.